Rainbow Magic, The Rainbow Fairies. Ruby the Red Fairy by Daisy Meadows, illustrated by Georgie Ripper. The End of the Rainbow.
"Look, Dad,"
said Rachel Walker. She pointed across the blue-green sea at the rocky island ahead of them. The fairy was sailing towards it, dipping up and down on the rolling waves.
"Is that Rainspell Island?"
she asked. Her dad nodded. "Yes, it is," he said, smiling. "Our holiday is about to begin." The waves slapped against the side of the ferry as it bobbed up and down on the water. Rachel felt her heart thump with excitement. She could see white cliffs and emerald green fields on the island, and golden sandy beaches with rock pools dotted here and there. Suddenly, a few fat raindrops plopped down onto Rachel's head. "Oh!" she gasped, surprised. The sun was still shining. Rachel's mom grabbed her hand. "Let's get under cover," she said, leading Rachel inside.
"Isn't that strange?"
Rachel said.
"Sunshine and rain."
"Let's hope the rain stops before we get off the ferry," said Mr. Walker. "Now, where did I put that map of the island?" Rachel looked out of the window, her eyes opened wide. A girl was standing alone on the deck. Her dark hair was wet with raindrops, but she didn't seem to care. She just stared up at the sky. Rachel looked over at her mom and dad. They were busy studying the map, so Rachel slipped back outside to see what was so interesting. And there it was. In the blue sky high above them was the most amazing rainbow that Rachel had ever seen. One end of the rainbow was far out to sea. The other seemed to fall somewhere on Rainspell Island. All of the colors were bright and clear.
"Isn't it perfect?"
the dark-haired girl whispered to Rachel.
"Yes, it is."
Rachel agreed.
"Are you going to Rainspell on holiday?"
The girl nodded.
"We're staying for a week," she said. "I'm Kirsty Tate."
Rachel smiled as the rain began to stop.
"I'm Rachel Walker. We're staying at Mermaid Cottage," she added. "And we're at Dolphin Cottage," said Kirsty. "Do you think we might be near each other?" "I hope so," Rachel replied.
She had a feeling she was going to like Kirsty. Kirsty leaned over the rail and looked down into the shimmering water.
"The sea looks really deep, doesn't it?" she said. "There might even be mermaids down there watching us right now."
Rachel stared at the waves. She saw something that made her heart skip a beat.
"Look," she said. "Is that a mermaid's hair?"
Then she laughed when she saw that it was just seaweed.
"It could be a mermaid's necklace," said Kirsty, smiling. "Maybe she lost it when she was trying to escape from a sea monster."
The ferry was now sailing into Rainspell's tiny harbor. Seagulls flew around them, and fishing boats bobbed on the water.
"Look at that big white cliff over there," Kirsty said.
She pointed it out to Rachel.
"It looks a bit like a giant's face, doesn't it?"
Rachel looked and nodded. Kirsty seemed to see magic everywhere. "There you are, Rachel," called Mrs. Walker. Rachel turned round and saw her mom and dad coming out onto the deck. "We'll be getting off the ferry in a few minutes," Mrs. Walker added.
"Mom, Dad, this is Kirsty," Rachel said. "She's staying at Dolphin Cottage."
"That's right next door to ours," said Mr. Walker. "I remember seeing it on the map." Rachel and Kirsty looked at each other in delight.
"I'd better go and find my mom and dad," said Kirsty.
She looked round.
"Oh, here they are."
Kirsty's mom and dad came over to say hello to the Walkers. Then the ferry docked and everyone began to leave the boat. "Our cottages are on the other side of the harbor," said Rachel's dad, looking at the map. "It's not far." Mermaid Cottage and Dolphin Cottage were right next to the beach. Rachel loved her bedroom, which was high up in the attic. From the window, she could see the waves rolling onto the sand. A shout from outside made her look down. It was Kirsty. She was standing under the window waving at her.
"Let's go and explore the beach."
Kirsty called. Rachel dashed outside to join her. Seaweed lay in piles on the sand, and there were tiny pink and white shells dotted about.
I love it here already,
Rachel shouted happily above the noise of the seagulls.
Me too,
Kirsty said. She pointed up at the sky.
Look, the rainbow's still there.
Rachel looked up. The rainbow glowed brightly among the fluffy white clouds.
Have you heard the story about the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow?
Kirsty asked. Rachel nodded.
Yes, but that's just in fairy stories,
she said. Kirsty grinned.
Maybe, but let's go and find out for ourselves.
Okay, Rachel agreed.
We can explore the island at the same time.
They rushed back to tell their parents where they were going. Then, Kirsty and Rachel set off along a lane behind the cottages. It led them away from the beach, across green fields and towards a small wood. Rachel kept looking up at the rainbow. She was worried that it would start to fade now that the rain had stopped, but the colors stayed clear and bright.
It looks like the end of the rainbow is over there, Kirsty said. Come on!
And she hurried towards the trees. The wood was cool and green after the heat of the sun. Rachel and Kirsty followed a winding path until they came to a clearing. Then they both stopped and stared. The rainbow shone down onto the grass through a gap in the trees. And there, at the rainbow's end, lay an old black pot. A tiny surprise.
Look,
Kirsty whispered.
There really is a pot of gold. It could just be a cooking pot, Rachel said doubtfully. Some campers might have left it behind.
But Kirsty shook her head.
I don't think so, she said.
It looks really old. Rachel stared at the pot. It was sitting on the grass upside down.
Let's have a closer look,
said Kirsty. She ran to the pot and tried to turn it over.
Oh, it's heavy,
she gasped. She tried again, but the pot didn't move. Rachel rushed to help her. They both pushed and pushed at the pot. This time it moved, just a little.
Let's try again,
Kirsty panted.
Are you ready, Rachel?
Tap, tap, tap. Rachel and Kirsty stared at each other.
What was that?
Rachel gasped.
I don't know,
whispered Kirsty. Tap, tap.
There it is again,
Kirsty said. She looked down at the pot lying on the grass.
You know what? I think it's coming from inside this pot.
Rachel's eyes opened wide.
Are you sure?
She bent down and put her ear to the pot. Tap, tap. Then, to her amazement, Rachel heard a tiny voice.
Help!
It called.
Help me!
Rachel grabbed Kirsty's arm.
Did you hear that?
She asked. Kirsty nodded.
Quick, she said. We must turn the pot over.
Rachel and Kirsty pushed at the pot as hard as they could. It began to rock from side to side on the grass.
We're nearly there,
Rachel panted.
Keep pushing, Kirsty.
The girls pushed with all their might. Suddenly, the pot turned over and rolled onto its side. Rachel and Kirsty were taken by surprise. They both lost their balance and landed on the grass with a thump.
Look,
Kirsty whispered, breathing hard. A small shower of sparkling red dust had flown out of the pot. Rachel and Kirsty gasped with surprise. The dust hung in the air above them, and there, right in the middle of the glittering cloud, was a tiny winged girl. Rachel and Kirsty watched in wonder as the tiny girl fluttered in the sunlight, her delicate wings sparkling with all the colors of the rainbow.
Oh, Rachel,
Kirsty whispered.
It's a fairy.
Fairy magic. The fairy flew over Rachel and Kirsty's heads. Her short, silky dress was the color of ripe strawberries. Red crystal earrings glowed in her ears. Her golden hair was plaited with tiny red roses, and her little feet wore crimson slippers. She waved her scarlet wand, and the shower of sparkling red fairy dust floated softly down to the ground. Where it landed, all sorts of red flowers appeared with a pop. Rachel and Kirsty watched open-mouthed. It really and truly was a fairy.
"This is like a dream," Rachel said. "I always believed in fairies," Kirsty whispered back, "but I never thought I'd ever see one."
The fairy flew towards them.
"Oh, thank you so much,"
she called in a tiny silvery voice.
"I'm free at last."
She glided down and landed on Kirsty's hand. Kirsty gasped. The fairy felt lighter and softer than a butterfly.
"I was beginning to think I'd never get out of the pot,"
the fairy said. Kirsty wanted to ask the fairy so many things, but she didn't know where to start.
"Tell me your names, quickly,"
said the fairy. She fluttered up into the air again.
"There's so much to be done, and we must get started right away."
Rachel wondered what the fairy meant.
"I'm Rachel," she said. "And I'm Kirsty," said Kirsty. "But who are you?" "I'm the Red Rainbow Fairy, but call me Ruby,"
the fairy replied.
"Ruby," Kirsty breathed. "A rainbow fairy."
She and Rachel stared at each other in excitement. This really was magic.
"Yes," said Ruby. "And I have 6 sisters, Amber, Saffron, Fern, Sky, Izzy, and Heather. 1 for each color of the rainbow, you see." "What do rainbow fairies do?"
Rachel asked. Ruby flew over and landed lightly on Rachel's hand.
"It's our job to put all the different colors into Fairyland," she explained. "So why were you shut up inside that old pot?" asked Rachel. "And where are your sisters?" Kirsty added.
Ruby's golden wings drooped. Her eyes filled with tiny sparkling tears.
"I don't know," she said. "Something terrible has happened in Fairyland. We really need your help."
Fairies in danger. Kirsty stared down at Ruby sitting sadly on Rachel's hand.
"Of course we'll help you," she said. "Just tell us how," added Rachel.
Ruby wiped the tears from her eyes.
"Thank you," she said. "But first I must show you the terrible thing that has happened. Follow me as quickly as you can."
She flew into the air, her wings shimmering in the sunshine. Rachel and Kirsty followed Ruby across the clearing. She danced ahead of them, glowing like a crimson flame. She stopped at a small pond under a weeping willow tree.
"Look, I can show you what happened yesterday," she said.
She flew over the pond and scattered another shower of sparkling fairy dust with her tiny red wand. At once, the water lit up with a strange silver light. It bubbled and fizzed and then became still. With wide eyes, Rachel and Kirsty watched as a picture appeared. It was like looking through a window into another land.
"Oh, Rachel, look," said Kirsty.
A river of brightest blue ran swiftly past hills of greenest green. Scattered on the hillsides were red and white toadstool houses, and on top of the highest hill stood a silver palace with 4 pink towers. The towers were so high, their points were almost hidden by the fluffy white clouds floating past. Hundreds of fairies were making their way towards the palace. Some were walking and some were flying. Rachel and Kirsty could see goblins, elves, imps, and pixies too. Everyone seemed very excited.
"Yesterday was the day of the Fairyland Midsummer Ball,"
Ruby explained. She flew over the pond and pointed down with her wand to a spot in the middle of the scene.
"There I am, with my rainbow sisters."
Kirsty and Rachel looked closely at where Ruby was pointing. They saw 7 fairies, each dressed prettily in their own rainbow color. Wherever they flew, they left a trail of fairy dust behind them.
"The Midsummer Ball is very special,"
Ruby went on.
"And my sisters and I are always in charge of sending out invitations."
To the sound of tinkling music, the front doors of the palace slowly opened.
"Here come King Oberon and Queen Titania," said Ruby. "The Fairy King and Queen. They are about to begin the ball."
Kirsty and Rachel watched as the king and queen stepped out. The king wore a splendid golden coat and golden crown. His queen wore a silver dress and a tiara that sparkled with diamonds. Everyone cheered loudly. After a while, the king signaled for quiet. "Fairies," he began, "we are very glad to see you all here. Welcome to the Midsummer Ball." The fairies clapped their hands and cheered again. A band of green frogs in smart purple outfits started to play, and the dancing began. Suddenly, a gray mist seemed to fill the room. Kirsty and Rachel watched in alarm as all the fairies started to shiver, and a loud, chilly voice shouted out, "Stop the music!" The band fell silent. Everyone looked scared. A tall, bony figure was pushing his way through the crowd. He was dressed all in white, and there was a frost on his white hair and beard. Icicles hung from his clothes, but his face was red and angry.
"Who's that?"
Rachel asked with a shiver. Ice had begun to form around the edge of the pond.
"It's Jack Frost,"
said Ruby, and she shivered too. Jack Frost glared at the 7 rainbow fairies. "Why wasn't I invited to the Midsummer Ball?" he asked coldly. The rainbow fairies gasped in horror. Ruby looked up from the pond picture. She smiled sadly at Rachel and Kirsty.
"Yes, we forgot to invite Jack Frost,"
she said. The Fairy Queen stepped forward. "You are very welcome, Jack Frost," she said. "Please stay and enjoy the ball." But Jack Frost looked even more angry. "Too late," he hissed. "You forgot to invite me." He turned and pointed a thin, icy finger at the rainbow fairies. "Well, you will not forget this," he went on. "My spell will banish the rainbow fairies to the 7 corners of the mortal world. From this day on, Fairyland will be without color forever." Jack Frost's Spell. As Jack Frost cast his spell, a great icy wind began to blow. It picked up the 7 rainbow fairies and spun them up into the darkening sky. The other fairies watched in dismay. Jack Frost turned to the king and queen. "Your rainbow fairies will be trapped, never to return." With that, he left, leaving a trail of icy footprints. Quickly, the Fairy Queen stepped forward and lifted her silver wand. "I cannot undo Jack Frost's magic completely," she shouted as the wind howled and rushed around her. "But I can guide the rainbow fairies to a safe place until they can be rescued." The queen pointed her wand at the gray sky overhead. A black pot came spinning through the stormy clouds. It flew towards the rainbow fairies. One by one, the rainbow fairies tumbled into the pot. "Pot at the end of the rainbow, keep our rainbow fairies safely together," the queen called, "and take them to Rainspell Island." The pot flew out of sight behind a dark cloud, and the bright colors of Fairyland began to fade until it looked like an old black and white photograph.
"Oh no!"
Kirsty gasped. Then the picture in the pond vanished.
"So the Fairy Queen cast her own spell,"
Rachel said. She was bursting with questions.
"She put you and your sisters in the pot and sent you to Rainspell."
Ruby nodded.
"Our queen knew that we would be safe here," she said. "We know Rainspell well. It is a place full of magic. But where are your sisters?"
Kirsty wanted to know.
"They were in the pot too."
Ruby looked upset.
"Jack Frost's spell must have been stronger than the queen thought," she said. "As the pot spun through the sky, the wind blew my sisters out again. I was at the bottom, so I was safe. But I was trapped when the pot landed upside down." "So are your sisters somewhere on Rainspell?"
Kirsty asked. Ruby nodded.
"Yes, but they're scattered all over the island. Jack Frost's spell has trapped them too."
She flew towards Kirsty and landed on her shoulder.
"That's where you and Rachel come in."
"How?" Rachel asked.
You found me, didn't you? The fairy went on. That's because you believe in magic.
She flew from Kirsty's shoulder to Rachel's.
So you could rescue my rainbow sisters too. Then we can all bring color back to Fairyland again.
A visit to Fairyland.
Of course we'll search for your sisters, Kirsty said quickly. Won't we, Rachel?
Rachel nodded.
Oh, thank you,
Ruby said happily.
But we're only here for a week, Rachel said. Will that be long enough? We must get started right away, said Ruby. First, I must take you to Fairyland to meet our king and queen. They will be very pleased to know that you are going to help me find my sisters.
Rachel and Kirsty stared at Ruby.
You're taking us to Fairyland?
Kirsty gasped. She could hardly believe her ears, nor could Rachel.
But how will we get there?
Rachel wanted to know.
We'll fly there,
Ruby replied.
But we can't fly,
Rachel pointed out. Ruby smiled. She whirled up into the air and flew over the girls' heads. Then she swirled her wand above them. Magic red fairy dust fluttered down. Rachel and Kirsty began to feel a bit strange. Were the trees getting bigger or were they getting smaller? They were getting smaller. Smaller and smaller and smaller until they were the same size as Ruby.
I'm tiny,
Rachel laughed. She was so small, the flowers around her seemed like trees. Kirsty twisted round to look at her back. She had wings, shiny and delicate as a butterfly's. Ruby beamed at them.
Now you can fly,
she said.
Let's go.
Rachel twitched her shoulders. Her wings fluttered, and she felt herself rise up into the air. She felt quite wobbly at first. It was very odd.
Help!
Kirsty yelled as she shot up into the air.
I'm not very good at this.
Come on, said Ruby, taking their hands.
I'll help you.
She led them up out of the glade. Rachel looked down on Rainspell Island. She could see the cottages next to the beach and the harbor.
Where is Fairyland, Ruby? Kirsty asked.
They were flying higher and higher up into the clouds.
It's so far away that no mortal could ever find it,
Ruby said. They flew on through the clouds for a long, long time. But at last, Ruby turned to them and smiled.
We're here,
she said. As they flew down from the clouds, Kirsty and Rachel saw places they recognized from the pond picture. The palace, the hillsides with their toadstool houses, the river and flowers. But there were no bright colors now. Because of Jack Frost's spell, everything was a drab shade of gray. Even the air felt cold and damp. A few fairies walked miserably across the hillsides. Their wings hung limply down their backs. No one could be bothered to fly. Suddenly, one of the fairies looked up into the sky.
Look,
she shouted.
It's Ruby! She's come back!
At once the fairies flew up towards Ruby, Kirsty, and Rachel. They circled around them, looking much happier and asking lots of questions.
Have you come from Rainspell, Ruby? Where are the other rainbow fairies? Who are your friends? First, we must see the king and queen. Then I will tell you everything,
Ruby promised. King Oberon and Queen Titania were seated on their thrones. Their palace was as gray and gloomy as everywhere else in Fairyland. But they smiled warmly when Ruby arrived with Rachel and Kirsty. Welcome back, Ruby, the queen said. We have missed you.
Your Majesties, I have found 2 mortals who believe in magic,
Ruby announced.
These are my friends, Kirsty and Rachel.
Quickly, Ruby explained what had happened to the other rainbow fairies. She told everyone how Rachel and Kirsty had rescued her. You have our thanks, the king told them. Our rainbow fairies are very special to us. And will you help us to find Ruby's rainbow sisters? The queen asked.
Yes, we will,
Kirsty said.
But how will we know where to look?
Rachel wanted to know. The trick is not to look too hard, said Queen Titania. Don't worry. As you enjoy the rest of your holiday, the magic you need to find each rainbow fairy will find you. Just wait and see. King Oberon rubbed his beard thoughtfully. You have 6 days of your holiday left, and 6 fairies to find, he said. A fairy each day? That's a lot of fairy finding. You will need some special help. He nodded at one of his footmen, a plump frog in a buttoned-up jacket. The frog hopped over to Rachel and Kirsty and handed them each a tiny silver bag. The bags contain magic tools, the queen told them. Don't look inside them yet. Open them only when you really need to, and you will find something to help you. She smiled at Kirsty and Rachel. Look! Shouted another frog footman suddenly. Ruby is beginning to fade! Rachel and Kirsty looked at Ruby in horror. The fairy was growing paler before their eyes. Her lovely dress was no longer red, but pink, and her golden hair was turning white. Jack Frost's magic is still at work, said the king, looking worried. We cannot undo his spell until the rainbow fairies are all together again. Quickly, Ruby, urged the queen. You must return to Rainspell at once. Ruby, Kirsty, and Rachel rose into the air, their wings fluttering.
Don't worry, Kirsty called as they flew higher. We'll be back with all the rainbow fairies very soon.
Good luck, called the king and queen. Rachel and Kirsty watched Ruby worriedly as they flew off. But as they got further away from Fairyland, Ruby's color began to return. Soon she was bright and sparkling again. They reached Rainspell at last. Ruby led Rachel and Kirsty to the clearing in the wood, and they landed next to the old black pot. Then Ruby scattered fairy dust over Rachel and Kirsty. There was a puff of glittering red smoke, and the 2 girls shot up to their normal size again. Rachel wriggled her shoulders. Yes, her wings had gone.
Oh, I really loved being a fairy, Kirsty said.
They watched as Ruby sprinkled her magic dust over the old black pot.
What are you doing? Rachel asked. Jack Frost's magic means that I can't help you look for my sisters, Ruby replied sadly. So I will wait for you here, in the pot at the end of the rainbow.
Suddenly, the pot began to move. It rolled across the grass and stopped under the weeping willow tree. The tree's branches hung right down to the ground.
The pot will be hidden under the tree, Ruby explained. I'll be safe there. We'd better start looking for the other rainbow fairies, Rachel said to Kirsty. Where shall we start?
Ruby shook her head.
Remember what the queen said, she told them. The magic will come to you.
She flew over and sat on the edge of the pot. Then she pushed aside one of the willow branches and waved at Rachel and Kirsty.
Goodbye, and good luck. We'll be back soon, Ruby, Kirsty promised. We're going to find all your rainbow sisters, Rachel said firmly. Just you wait and see.